I want to ask you a couple of questions about a recent event in Jefferson County, a baby who unfortunately passed away, and people are saying that it's because of your new law.
First of all, I want to say that as someone who sits on the Early Learning and Human Services Committee, it is our utmost duty to protect every child under the custody of the state. Those are our children. Obviously, these kind of tragedies are horrible, and we need to do everything we can to make sure we understand what happened. When there's a tragedy, I think people want to blame, find an instant solution. I think instead what we need to do is evaluate the system and find out where are the gaps in the system that might have failed this young person.
So what is your understanding of the events that ended in the death of this child?
My understanding is that the baby had traces of fentanyl from the mother, was born with that. And so a safety plan was put in place that the child would be cared for by someone else other than the mother who tested positive. And in that decision, the safety plan was put in place for the father to live with someone else and take care of the baby. I understand the father might have had some housing challenges, and so placing him in another home was part of that safety plan. I understand the father took a UA test to prove if he was currently on drugs and that it came out clean. But none of those circumstances of that safety plan in any way affects 1227. As a matter of fact, the child never even entered the court system. So the ambiguity that a few judges have said about not understanding the law doesn't even come in place because that case was never even taken up before the judge.
So let's clarify. What was the intent of this bill in 2021?
Absolutely. In our antiquated child welfare laws that have been around for over 100 years, like in many states across our country, it was time that we start looking at the damage and the harm that we're doing, the irrevocable damage and harm that happens when we remove a child from their family. And the statistics we were getting back that over 60% of the children removed were removed over neglect situations versus physical harm, sexual abuse, sexual exploitation, and that those with neglect oftentimes had to do with homelessness, substance abuse, poverty. And we wanted to make sure that this state took an active role in making sure that we put resources into families so that we could stop this generational trauma that exists. We also made it in parity with the Indian Child Welfare Act, the ICWA law, that everything that is in there regarding you cannot remove a child merely on poverty, merely on substance abuse, merely on homelessness comes from an existing law that is already in place for our Indian children, making it parity for all children. That was very important as well. The law never touches that you can't remove a child for homelessness or substance abuse or poverty. It says that that can't be the only factor. So the point of the law was to make sure that we take a comprehensive look. If substance abuse is present, for example, in a situation where I met a mother who was living with her parents, was fighting addiction, was trying to go to treatment, had some times where she failed and back and forth, and had a 10-year-old son. Her parents were in charge of that 10-year-old. The mother was living in the home. She had resources around them. The child was being fed. He was being well taken care of. That's a different situation. And just because there's substance abuse may not necessitate removing if the child is safe. Compared to a situation where there was another mom who's a single mom, had no resources, no one to help her, and was in addiction and left a 2-year-old for 3 days alone in a home before they found her. Totally different situation. And of course, that substance abuse plays a huge part of that and the lack of resources. So that's what we're talking about, is the extremity of these situations. When we say substance abuse, it could be that you have a partner who's trying to get clean, but you have all the services wrapped around your child, versus someone that causes harm to the child, physical harm, severe neglect, leaving a child with no food, etc. Ensuring that DCFS policy, which is already in place, it was already being put already before this law, it was their intent all the time, which is why they came in full support of this bill, that this be consistently played out throughout the state, that one of those factors alone should not be the reason to remove a child, but that other mitigating factors have to be taken under consideration.
Now, this measure passed not unanimously, but almost.
It passed with extraordinary support from both sides. Because when you traumatize a child in a family, when government comes in and takes a child, there's got to be some strong support for why you do that. The other thing I would say is that the statistics we received, that about 30% of children that were being removed are removed for 30 days or less. In other words, whatever the situation was remediated very quickly, and that child did not qualify to stay in long-term care. But the trauma experienced by those parents and that child will never go away. And so we were saying, let's put more intent up front and make sure that we provide those resources so that those 30% don't have to go through that unnecessarily. And I think people from both sides were in agreement.
What are your thoughts on bills that are trying to change your current law?
Well, there are some, if there's any substance abuse in the house, or any trace of fentanyl in the house even. Let me tell you how that plays out. Here's the reality of that. We heard a wonderful testimony from a woman, 4 children at home, 3 currently. Her 16-year-old smoked marijuana, and unfortunately it was laced with fentanyl. And we've heard these sad stories, not knowing it was laced with fentanyl. The fact that there was marijuana in her house with fentanyl in it, under some of the laws that were being introduced, would remove her other 3 children. This lady already lost her son. She's been devastated. Those siblings have been devastated. Can you imagine the extra trauma of removing her other children because there was fentanyl in the house? Sometimes fentanyl is prescribed, sometimes other synthetic opioids or relatives. All we are saying is we always have to take a comprehensive view, that we can't make blanket law statements that say we're going to remove your children if we even see this, because when we do that, talk about government overreach. We've got to be careful. At the same time, our heart breaks. We have to look at this fentanyl crisis comprehensively. How do we educate our children? How do we pass education in schools? How do we pass them in our boys and girls clubs, in our nonprofits? How do we educate parents? How do we get tough on who is distributing this? What do we need to do? But it definitely has to be a comprehensive approach. And more importantly, how do we put in services? There are people that have said, I have tried to get into services and they didn't have an opening. My daughter tried to get in, didn't have an opening, and then I lost her. How tragic is that? We can do better from our communities than that. Once you start identifying a drug in statute, it's never ending. Because there's always going to be something else. And the potencies are going to change, and we can't possibly keep up with that kind of data, right? We've got to give discretion to the department and public health to identify lethality of drugs, because it's never ending. We also heard a lot of testimony that the minute we start putting that into law, people that want treatment will run away. The minute they know that they're being threatened with losing their children, they're not going to walk into that center and say, I need help. So this is a much more complicated issue. But again, the intent of 1227, parity with our ICWA, Indian welfare law, making sure that poverty isn't the only reason you remove a child, that homelessness isn't the only reason you remove a child, that substance abuse isn't the only reason you lose a child, but rather putting in those resources and making sure you're assessing all the resources and everyone that is there to help the child. But if it is tied to physical harm or neglect, totally different story. Never change the law on that. Of course, remove the children. I've got to say this too. After this law passed, the majority of judges across the state have been following that intent. They have removed children. There are a few judges who have struggled with whether or not that is clear to them. We are working on legislation to make it as clear as we can. I would hope that they would receive training available, that they would go to those trainings and they would talk to their peers and their colleagues that are removing children. There is no reason not to. If the child is in harm's way, we must remove a child to keep them safe. Nothing in this law prohibits that.